The P-38 Lightning shuddered violently. A deep, tearing sound ripped through the air as 20-millimeter cannon rounds tore through Lieutenant Richard Bong's left engine cowling. He was at 18,000 feet, suspended between the brilliant blue of the sky and the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. He was alone. Just moments ago, his wingman had been right there, a comforting presence off his wing. Now, that same plane was a spiraling trail of black smoke plunging towards the waves of the Solomon Islands below. The August 1943 sun blazed through his canopy, a cruel, indifferent eye in the sky. Bong threw the twin-boomed fighter into another desperate banking turn, his muscles screaming with the strain of the G-forces, but it was no use. The Japanese Zero behind him was a phantom, a predator. It matched his every move effortlessly, its pilot a master of his craft. The distance was closing with a terrifying mathematical precision. Bong wasn't a rookie. He'd been trained at the best fighter schools in America. He knew the book, every single page of it. Barrel rolls, split S's, chandelles, scissors maneuvers. He knew every defensive tactic ever invented. And in the last 90 seconds, he had tried them all. Every single one. Each time, the Zero pilot had countered with a casual, almost contemptuous efficiency. It was like fighting a ghost that could anticipate his every thought. Now, the enemy fighter was less than 200 yards behind him, positioned perfectly in his vulnerable 6 o'clock. The Zero's guns were lined up for the killing shot. The shot that would send Richard Bong to join his wingman in a watery grave. His instrument panel was a Christmas tree of chaos. Red warning lights flickered and flashed. Oil pressure on the damaged engine was dropping like a stone. His airspeed was bleeding off as he fought just to keep the nose of the heavy P-38 from dropping. Altitude was unwinding, gravity and battle damage conspiring to pull him out of the sky. He had maybe 10 seconds left. 10 seconds before the Zero's guns would finish what they'd started, and Richard Bong would become just another statistic in the brutal arithmetic of Pacific air combat. Death was staring him in the face. The playbook was empty. There were no options left. And in that final moment, with nothing left to lose, Bong did something that every instructor, every manual, every veteran pilot had warned him would kill him instantly.
He rolled the P-38 completely inverted, wheels pointing straight up at the sky, and shoved the control stick violently forward. The Lightning's nose dropped toward the ocean in a screaming vertical dive. But this wasn't a normal dive. This was a plunge into madness. Bong was hurtling toward the Pacific upside down. The force was incredible. Blood rushed into his skull so fast that his entire vision turned a blinding crimson. The instrument panel, the sky, the world, it all disappeared into a red blur. For 2 seconds that stretched into an eternity, Richard Bong flew completely blind, enduring negative G-forces that no training manual said his aircraft or his body could possibly survive. The P-38's twin Allison engines screamed in protest, a high-pitched mechanical shriek of agony. Everything loose in the cockpit, spent shell casings, a stray map, dust, floated up from the floor and slammed into the canopy above his head. His oxygen mask felt like it was trying to tear itself from his face. Every tiny blood vessel in his eyes felt like it was on the verge of bursting. When he finally rolled the aircraft right side up at 12,000 feet, having dropped an insane 6,000 feet in those 2 terrifying seconds, the Zero was gone. Not just behind him, gone, completely, vanished from the sky as if it had never existed. Bong circled cautiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scanned every quadrant of the sky, his eyes straining, expecting the ghost to reappear at any moment. But he found nothing. The Japanese fighter that had been seconds away from killing him had simply disappeared. What Richard Bong didn't know in that moment, as he gasped for breath and wiped blood from his eyes, was that he had just accidentally discovered a maneuver that would change the entire Pacific Air War. A desperate, impossible, suicidal-looking trick that would shatter the Japanese Zero's reign of terror over Allied pilots. A trick that would ultimately help turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. And within months, what began as one terrified pilot's instinctive, panic-driven move would become whispered fighter pilot wisdom, spreading across every dusty airfield from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. This is the story of how American pilots learned to fly upside down to survive, and how that one discovery transformed the deadliest aircraft in the Pacific theater from an unstoppable killing machine into a target that American fighters could finally decisively beat.
It's a story of innovation born from sheer desperation, and of how the unbending laws of physics ultimately proved more powerful than the most maneuverable fighter plane ever built. To understand why Bong's accidental discovery was so incredibly revolutionary, you have to go back. You need to understand just how completely, how utterly, the Japanese Zero dominated the Pacific skies in 1942 and early 1943. When American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi A6M Zero in combat, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was like something from another planet. This Japanese fighter violated every single assumption American military intelligence had made about enemy capabilities. It wasn't just good, it was legendary. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter with an ease that was frankly insulting. It could climb faster, it could fly farther, and it could operate at higher altitudes than anything the Americans or their allies had in the sky. In the brutal early battles over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots flying Zeros were achieving kill ratios that seemed like a typo. They were statistically impossible. For every 3 Japanese aircraft shot down, the Allies were losing 9. In some engagements, the ratio was even worse. It was a massacre. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering, a testament to a completely different design philosophy. Its designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had been given a seemingly impossible set of requirements by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Build a fighter with the maneuverability of a biplane, the speed of a monoplane, and the range to escort bombers all the way to China and back. To achieve this, Horikoshi made radical choices. He created a fighter that weighed just 3,700 pounds empty. For comparison, its main American adversary at the time, the P-40 Warhawk, weighed over 5,000 pounds. But this incredible weight savings came at a steep price. The Zero had no armor plating to protect the pilot, none. A single well-placed rifle-caliber bullet could kill the man at the controls. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected, lacking the self-sealing rubber bladders that were becoming standard in American aircraft. This meant that if a Zero's fuel tank was hit, it didn't just leak, it often exploded in a brilliant, fatal fireball. The airframe itself was built to the absolute minimum stress tolerances, sacrificing durability and ruggedness for supreme agility. It was a scalpel, designed for one perfect cut, not a sword designed to withstand the clash of battle. But in pure dogfighting performance, these sacrifices created a fighter that seemed supernatural. At combat speeds, the Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in just under 16 seconds. An American P-40 needed 23 seconds to do the same thing. In the lethal ballet of a dogfight, where 2 fighters merge at hundreds of miles per hour, that 7-second difference wasn't just an advantage, it was an eternity. It meant that every single time an American pilot tried to get into a turning fight with a Zero, the outcome was preordained. The American would turn, the Zero would turn tighter, and before the American pilot could even complete his circle, the Japanese fighter would be on his tail, guns lined up for an easy kill. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you might already know about the Pacific Air War. Is this a story you've heard before? Drop a comment down below and let me know. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into military history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. These stories take a serious amount of research to get all the details right, and just knowing you're out there watching makes it all worthwhile. Okay, back to the story. American pilots were dying by the dozens, by the hundreds, because they were trying to fight the Zero on its own terms. In 1942, fighter tactics were still heavily influenced by the romantic dogfighting doctrines of World War I. Pilots were taught to turn and burn, to get inside the enemy's circle, to outmaneuver him until you could bring your guns to bear. This worked beautifully against the German fighters in Europe. Planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were generally heavier and less maneuverable than their Allied counterparts like the Spitfire. In Europe, turning with the enemy was a valid, winning strategy. But in the Pacific, that doctrine was a death sentence. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, one of the U.S. Navy's most brilliant and innovative tacticians, watched his pilots die. He watched them get shredded in training exercises against captured Zeros. He became obsessed, spending weeks on a blackboard, using matchsticks to represent the planes, trying to find a solution. He analyzed the Zero's capabilities and realized something absolutely crucial.
Yes, the Zero could turn better than anything America had. Yes, it could climb faster. But its very strengths, that incredibly lightweight construction, also created profound vulnerabilities that could be exploited if, and this was a very big if, American pilots stopped trying to turn with it. American fighters had their own advantages the Zero couldn't hope to match. The P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the F4U Corsair all had far more powerful engines. This gave them superior speed in level flight, and especially in a dive. They were built like flying tanks, with rugged construction that could survive battle damage that would literally tear a fragile Zero apart. Their fuel systems were designed to tolerate violent maneuvering without starving the engines of fuel. And crucially, their pilots were protected by armor plating and reinforced cockpits. Thatch developed what became famously known as the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver where two American fighters would fly in coordination, weaving back and forth, using one another as bait to lure a Zero into the sights of the other. It worked. It absolutely saved lives. But it required perfect, constant coordination between wingmen, and it was fundamentally a defensive tactic. It could help American pilots survive an encounter, but it didn't give them a reliable way to actually go on the offensive and beat the Zero in a one-on-one fight. For that, they needed something else, something that wouldn't come from careful tactical planning on a blackboard, but from a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation in the heat of battle. While Richard Bong's experience in August is the perfect dramatic example, the first documented, deliberate use of this new tactic happened a few months earlier, on April 7, 1943, over the Russell Islands in the Solomons Chain. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying a P-38 Lightning, found himself in exactly the situation that had killed so many of his comrades. 8 Japanese Zeros had bounced his flight from above, diving out of the sun. In the chaos of the initial merge, Lynch became separated from his wingmen. He was alone at 20,000 feet with multiple enemy fighters swarming around him, all trying to maneuver onto his tail. Lynch was no rookie. He was an experienced pre-war veteran who had been flying almost daily since Pearl Harbor. He knew the odds he was facing were slim to none. He also knew with absolute certainty that trying to turn with these Zeros would be suicide. His P-38 was faster than the enemy fighters in a straight line, but they had the altitude advantage. If he tried to simply run away in level flight, they would dive down on him and catch him before he could build up enough speed. He needed to break contact, to escape, right now. But every standard escape maneuver he knew required him to turn, which would just let the Zeros cut inside his circle and close the distance even further. In that moment of life or death, Lynch made a decision that must have seemed utterly insane to the Japanese pilots watching. He rolled his P-38 completely inverted and pushed the stick forward, initiating a vertical dive while completely upside down. His world flipped. The ocean that had been below was now a ceiling above him. The sky that had been above was now a floor below him. And the P-38, built like a fortress compared to the fragile Zero, plunged toward the distant ocean, its speed building with terrifying rapidity, while Lynch's vision turned red from the crushing negative G-forces. What happened next stunned Lynch as much as it would later stun the Japanese pilots. The Zeros couldn't follow.
When they tried to roll inverted and push their noses down into the dive to maintain pursuit, their lightweight airframes began to shudder and warp under the unfamiliar strain of negative G-forces. But worse, much worse, was what happened to their engines. Their fuel systems, designed for the positive G-forces of climbing and turning, simply couldn't handle the inverted pressure. Fuel, pulled by gravity in the wrong direction, stopped flowing to the engines. The carburetors starved. Some of the Zero engines simply quit entirely, coughing into silence, leaving their pilots to glide helplessly as Lynch's P-38 screamed away at an ever-increasing speed. Lynch didn't just escape. He turned a desperate defense into a stunning offense. At 12,000 feet, he rolled right side up, pulled back on the stick, and used his massive speed advantage to execute a zoom climb, rocketing back up to altitude. The Zeros, now scattered, confused, and struggling with their engines, were below him and slower. The hunter, now in the blink of an eye, became the hunted. Lynch dove on two of them from above, using his superior speed and the element of complete surprise. His 6.50 caliber machine guns converged on a Zero that never even saw him coming.
ザイのファイターはシンプルにディスインテグレートアンダルヘビーカリバーブレツ。リンチファイナリーリターンとベースエンクライム、イクゾーストアウトの日の日コックピット、ヒスフェイスはタイなデッドドットでかばれていた。バーストブラッドベッセルズ、フロムザネガティブ G フォーシーズ、初クリエイテッド、ハンドレッツオブタイニーヘモラジズ、アクロスヒズスキン、アコンディションノーンアズペテチア。ヒズアイズはブラッドショット、ザワイツオールモストコンプリートリレッド。He had a splitting headache that would last for 3 full days. But he was alive, and he had just discovered something that would change everything. Lynch didn't keep his discovery to himself. That evening, over warm beers in the pilot's tent, he described exactly what he had done and what had happened. The younger pilots listened with a mixture of raw disbelief and morbid fascination. Flying inverted was dangerous. Pushing into a dive while inverted was suicidal. Also, they had been taught. But Lynch was standing right there, very much alive, with 2 confirmed kills to show for it. And he insisted, absolutely insisted, that the Zeros physically could not follow him through the maneuver. The physics of what Lynch had discovered were actually pretty straightforward once you broke them down. In normal level flight, gravity pulls down on a pilot with 1g of force. During a normal dive, when a pilot pulls the stick back to curve the plane's path downward, it creates positive g forces. These forces press the pilot down into his seat, forcing blood away from his head and towards his feet. Fighter pilots trained constantly to handle high positive Gs, learning to tense their muscles and use special breathing techniques to maintain consciousness under forces that could reach 7 or 8 Gs in violent maneuvers. But an inverted dive did the exact opposite. It created negative G forces, which pushed the pilot up out of his seat against his harness and forced blood into his head instead of away from it. Human beings are very, very poorly adapted to handle negative Gs. Even 2 or 3 negative Gs can cause a red out where vision degrades as blood floods the retinas and can quickly lead to unconsciousness in untrained individuals. The tiny blood vessels in the eyes and face burst easily under this reversed pressure. It's an intensely unpleasant, painful, and disorienting experience.
But here was the critical discovery. While human pilots could train themselves to tolerate brief, agonizing periods of negative G-force, certain aircraft fuel systems simply could not adapt. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine used a float-type carburetor. Think of it like the float in your toilet tank. It was designed to work with gravity, with fuel flowing down from tanks mounted above the engine. When the aircraft went inverted and then pushed into a dive, gravity suddenly pulled the fuel away from the carburetor intake. The engine would sputter, cough, and very often quit entirely. In that moment, the fearsome Zero pilot found himself flying a very expensive, very fragile glider, while his American opponent accelerated away to safety. American aircraft, however, had a crucial technological advantage the Zero lacked. Many U.S. fighters, particularly the P-38 and later models of the P-47 and Corsair, used pressure carburetors or, even better, fuel injection systems. These systems didn't rely on gravity. They actively pumped fuel into the engine, maintaining a consistent delivery regardless of the aircraft's orientation. A P-38 could fly inverted for extended periods, and its Allison engines wouldn't miss a beat. This seemingly minor technical difference between a float-type carburetor and a pressure-fed system suddenly became a life-or-death advantage in combat. The tactic spread like wildfire through the American fighter squadrons. Not through official channels, mind you. The training manuals back home were never updated. This was knowledge passed through the informal, life-saving network that fighter pilots have always relied on. It was passed over drinks, in briefing rooms, and on the flight line. When you were about to fly into a combat zone where the slightest edge might be the difference between coming home and ending up as a name on a memorial wall, you listened to the veterans who had survived. And the veterans were increasingly all telling the same story. If a Zero gets on your tail, do not turn. Roll inverted and dive. The Zero cannot follow. Then use your speed to zoom back up and attack him from a position of advantage. Pilots started calling it different things. The split S when done from altitude, the inverted escape when used defensively, the negative G dive in formal debriefings. But informally among themselves, pilots just called it going upside down on them. And it became the first piece of advice that experienced pilots gave to the green rookies arriving fresh from stateside training. The official training manuals might have still warned against inverted flight as dangerous and disorienting, but in the skies over the Pacific, it was quickly becoming standard operating procedure. Captain Robert D. DeHaven of the 7th Fighter Squadron scored his first kill using the inverted dive in July 1943. A Zero had latched onto his 6 o'clock during a bomber escort mission near New Georgia. DeHaven did exactly what he'd heard the veterans talk about. He rolled inverted, pushed into the dive, and watched in his rearview mirror as the Zero's engine coughed black smoke and quit as it tried to follow him. He recovered at 8,000 feet, climbed back up, and caught the Japanese pilot still trying desperately to restart his engine. It was, he would later say, the easiest kill of his career. He would use that same tactic to score 13 more victories before the war ended. The physiological effects of the maneuver were brutal, but pilots accepted them as the price of survival. Flight surgeons on Guadalcanal began keeping records of pilots who regularly performed inverted dives, and the data was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Nearly every pilot who used the tactic reported the characteristic burst blood vessels in their eyes and across their face. Headaches that lasted for hours or even days were universal. Some pilots experienced temporary vision problems, like seeing spots or blurred halos around lights. A few even admitted to losing consciousness briefly during the most violent negative G encounters. But none of that mattered because the alternative was a fiery death. Pilots would joke darkly that they'd rather have a headache and a case of red-eye than a posthumous medal. The flight surgeons documented the effects, but they made no attempt to discourage the tactic. They understood what the pilots understood. In air combat against the Zero, you needed every single advantage you could find, and a few burst blood vessels were a cheap price to pay for your life. What made the inverted dive so utterly devastating was that it didn't just offer an escape, it completely reversed the tactical situation. Before this discovery, when a Zero got on an American fighter's tail, the American pilot was in serious trouble. His options were limited. His life expectancy was measured in seconds. But once pilots mastered the inverted dive, suddenly it was the Zero pilot who was in trouble. The American would roll inverted and dive away. The Zero, unable to follow, would be forced to break off. Within seconds, the American was now below his opponent, but with a massive speed advantage. He would then pull up in a powerful zoom climb, using his momentum to rocket back up above the Zero. And now he was in the perfect attack position, higher, faster, and often with the sun at his back. Japanese pilots were completely, utterly unprepared for this tactical revolution. Their entire training, their entire philosophy of air combat emphasized turning. It was built around exploiting the Zero's magnificent maneuverability to get inside an opponent's circle.
They had been taught, correctly, that American fighters were heavy and clumsy in a turn. They were taught that these planes couldn't climb well and that they were easy prey if you could just bait them into a classic turning dogfight. None of their training, none of their experience had addressed what to do when an American fighter suddenly rolled on its back and disappeared in a screening dive that their Zeros were physically incapable of following. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest scoring and most famous aces, wrote in his memoirs about his confusion and immense frustration when he first encountered American pilots using the inverted dive. He described meticulously maneuvering his Zero into a perfect firing position behind a P-38, lining up for what should have been an easy textbook kill, only to watch in sheer disbelief as the American plane rolled completely upside down and simply dove away. When Sakai instinctively tried to follow, his Zero's engine sputtered and threatened to quit, forcing him to break off the attack while his opponent escaped with impunity. What frustrated Sakai and his fellow pilots even more was that the Americans wouldn't just escape. They would immediately climb back up and attack from above, using their superior speed and the altitude advantage they had just gained in the dive. The tactical situation had been completely reversed in a matter of seconds. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was absolutely nothing Sakai or his fellow Zero pilots could do about it, except try to avoid getting into a tail chase situation in the first place. By late 1943, the inverted dive had evolved from a desperate last-ditch survival tactic into a deliberate, offensive combat strategy. American squadron commanders were now teaching it openly, despite the fact that official doctrine back in the States still frowned on inverted flight. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 475th Fighter Group, the Satan's Angels, told his P-38 pilots bluntly in their mission briefings, "If you try to turn with a Zero, you will die. If you try to climb with a Zero, you will die. You roll inverted, you dive, you use your speed, and you attack from above. That's how you survive, and that's how you win." The P-38 Lightning, with its unique twin-boom design, proved particularly effective at exploiting the inverted dive. The aircraft's distinctive shape made it instantly recognizable, and Japanese pilots learned to be extremely wary whenever they saw that forked tail silhouette. P-38 pilots developed a reputation for being aggressive, unpredictable, and deadly. They would deliberately bait Zeros into tail chases, feigning vulnerability, only to use the inverted dive to escape and mercilessly reverse the situation. It became a deadly cat-and-mouse game, but now the Americans were increasingly the cats. Captain Thomas Maguire, who would eventually become the second highest scoring American ace of the war with 38 victories, used the inverted dive to devastating effect over the Philippines in 1944. In one engagement over Light Gulf, he deliberately slowed his P-38 to entice a Zero into an attacking position. When the Japanese pilot took the bait and closed to firing range, Maguire rolled inverted and dived. The Zero pilot, committed to the kill, attempted to follow. His aircraft literally came apart in midair under the negative G stress. The wings folded upward, the lightweight airframe collapsed like a tin can, and the Zero tumbled into the ocean in pieces. Maguire hadn't even needed to fire his guns. The tactic worked with other American fighters too, though the technique required slight modifications for different aircraft. The F4U Corsair, with its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, the most powerful engine on any fighter in the war, could perform inverted dives that were even more violent than the P-38s. Corsair pilots learned to roll inverted and simply let the aircraft's incredible weight and raw power carry them down in screaming vertical dives that no Zero could ever hope to follow. Marine Corps pilots flying Corsairs from the legendary Henderson Field on Guadalcanal used the inverted dive to rack up staggering kill ratios against Japanese fighters that had, just a year earlier, seemed unbeatable. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug because of its barrel-shaped fuselage, was the heaviest of the American single-engine fighters. It weighed over 10,000 pounds. That weight was a huge disadvantage in a turning fight, but it became a massive, overwhelming advantage in a dive. P-47 pilots could roll inverted and dive so fast that they approached the speed of sound, reaching velocities where the aircraft's controls became sluggish and the plane bucked and shook.
But Japanese fighters couldn't come close to matching these speeds, and P-47 pilots exploited this weight advantage ruthlessly. By 1944, the tactical situation in the Pacific had been completely and irrevocably reversed. Kill ratios that had once favored the Japanese 3-1 were now running heavily in favor of the Americans. For every American fighter shot down, the US was now destroying 3, 4, sometimes 5 or more Japanese aircraft. The Zero, the ghost that had once ruled the Pacific skies with impunity, was now increasingly a liability rather than an asset. Its greatest strengths, its lightweight and lack of protection, which had made it so incredibly maneuverable, also made it fragile and fatally vulnerable to American tactics that exploited those very weaknesses. Japan desperately tried to counter this American tactical evolution. Their engineers developed new fighters like the J-2M Raiden and the Ki-84 Hayate, with more powerful engines and better high-speed handling. But these superior aircraft arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a real difference. And even these improved fighters couldn't fully match the diving performance of the American aircraft or maintain engine power during negative G maneuvers. The fundamental laws of physics that made the inverted dive so effective couldn't be engineered away quickly enough to matter. More critically, Japan was losing its experienced pilots at a catastrophic rate. The men who had dominated the early years of the war, the aces who had honed their skills over China and Pearl Harbor, were almost all dead. They had been shot down in the Solomons, over New Guinea, above the Philippines. The replacement pilots being thrown into combat were green. They had minimal training, sometimes fewer than 100 flight hours before they found themselves facing American veterans who had survived dozens or even hundreds of combat missions. These inexperienced Japanese pilots stood no chance against battle-hardened Americans who knew exactly how to exploit every single advantage their aircraft offered. And Richard Bong, the pilot whose desperate accidental maneuver in August 1943 had served as a perfect, terrifying example of the problem and its solution, went on to become America's highest-scoring ace of all time, with 40 confirmed victories. He refined the inverted dive into a deadly art form, often deliberately baiting Japanese fighters into attacking positions just so he could demonstrate the maneuver's effectiveness. Other pilots would watch his gun camera footage in stunned amazement as he calmly rolled inverted, dove away from a swarm of pursuing Zeros, then gracefully climbed back up and destroyed his confused and scattered opponents from above. The tactic's effectiveness wasn't just limited to fighter versus fighter combat. American bomber pilots adopted modified versions of the inverted dive to escape Japanese fighters that attacked their formations. While a fully loaded B-25 or B-26 couldn't perform the violent negative G maneuvers that a fighter could, bomber pilots learned that rolling partially inverted and pushing the nose down into a steep dive could still break the lock from a pursuing Zero, giving their defensive gunners the precious seconds they needed to get clear shots. Dozens of bomber crews credited this tactic with saving their lives. Perhaps as important as its tactical effectiveness was the psychological impact of the inverted dive on Japanese pilots. Fighter combat is as much about confidence and morale as it is about technology and tactics. In early 1943, Japanese pilots had been supremely, justifiably confident, secure in the knowledge that their Zeros could outturn and outclimb anything the Americans threw at them. By late 1943, that confidence was completely shattered. Japanese pilots now knew that if they committed to attacking an American fighter, there was a very good chance their opponent would simply roll inverted and escape, only to return a moment later from above, holding all the cards. The psychological edge had shifted, entirely and decisively, to the Americans. The influence of the inverted dive extended far beyond World War II. After the war, fighter tactics instructors analyzed what had worked in the Pacific and incorporated those hard-won lessons into training doctrine. The split S maneuver, which is essentially a formalized, more controlled version of the inverted dive, became a standard part of every fighter pilot's training. Pilots flying jets in Korea used variations of the tactic against the nimble Soviet-built MiG-15s. In Vietnam, American pilots facing agile MiGs rediscovered that diving away from a turning fight and using speed and energy to dictate the terms of engagement was still the key to survival and victory. The Navy's Fighter Weapons School, better known to the world as Top Gun, was established in 1969 specifically to teach American pilots how to fight outnumbered against agile foreign opponents. The curriculum they developed emphasized many of the same principles that pilots had discovered through blood and sacrifice while fighting Zeros in the Pacific. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid fighting on your opponent's terms, exploit speed and energy rather than trying to outturn a more maneuverable fighter. The lessons learned over the Solomon Islands in 1943 were still being taught to F-14 and F-18 pilots decades later. Thomas Lynch, the pilot who had first turned the desperate maneuver into a deliberate tactic, didn't survive the war. He was shot down and killed over the Philippines in March 1944. It wasn't in air-to-air combat. He was killed by anti-aircraft fire while strafing Japanese positions at low altitude. He was 27 years old. The inverted dive couldn't protect him from ground fire, and Lynch died doing exactly what he had taught his squadron to do: press the attack, take risks, and never give the enemy a moment's peace. His Medal of Honor citation credited him with 20 confirmed victories and praised his innovative tactical leadership. The inverted dive represents something profound about how wars are actually won. It wasn't the product of careful planning by generals in a distant headquarters. It wasn't invented by brilliant engineers in a laboratory. It was discovered accidentally by a desperate pilot doing something everyone had told him was impossible. It was refined through brutal trial and error by men who had to learn fast or die. And it spread not through official channels, but through the informal word-of-mouth networks that connect people facing the same deadly challenges. And it worked because it exploited fundamental laws of physics that no amount of Japanese engineering skill could overcome. The story also reveals how razor-thin the line between victory and defeat can be. The Zero was a genuinely outstanding aircraft. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was absolutely lethal. But it had a fatal flaw, a vulnerability that could be exploited if opposing pilots could just figure out how. For more than a year, American pilots died by the hundreds because they couldn't crack the puzzle. Then, a few brave men, out of sheer desperation, rolled inverted, survived, and suddenly the puzzle was solved. The Zero hadn't changed, the American aircraft hadn't changed, but the tactics had changed, and that made all the difference in the world. Today, a restored P-38 Lightning sits in the National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs. The aircraft is painted in the colors of Richard Bong's plane. It still bears the name Marge on its nose after Bong's fiancée. Next to it, a placard describes the inverted dive and its crucial role in turning the tide of the Pacific Air War. Visitors can look at that graceful, twin-boomed fighter and try to imagine what it must have taken for a young man to roll that aircraft inverted 18,000 feet above the ocean and push it into a dive that seemed certain to end in death. Richard Bong, America's ace of aces, survived the Pacific War with more aerial victories than any other American pilot in history. But he did not survive the peace. On August 6, 1945, the very same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Bong was killed while test piloting America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, in California. An engine failure on takeoff forced him to eject at too low an altitude. He was 24 years old. The tragic irony of the timing wasn't lost on those who knew him. The man who had pioneered the tactic that helped win the air war in the Pacific died on the very day that ensured the war would end. He never got to see the full, world-changing impact of what his desperate improvisation in August 1943 had accomplished. But his legacy lived on. It lived on in the hundreds, perhaps thousands of pilots who survived the war because they had learned to fly upside down when their lives depended on it. It lives on in the fighter pilot training programs that still teach the same fundamental principle: use your strengths, avoid your opponent's strengths, and never be afraid to do something that seems crazy if it might just keep you alive. The inverted dive, born from one pilot's terror and another's genius, became a piece of tactical wisdom that would outlive everyone who fought in the war that created it. The Japanese Zero was an unstoppable force, a ghost in the sky, until a few American pilots accidentally discovered something that changed everything. That discovery wasn't a new weapon or a better aircraft. It was simply the willingness to fly upside down when every instinct and every training manual said it would kill you. Sometimes that's all it takes to turn the tide of history. One person desperate enough to try the impossible and lucky enough to survive it.